Welcome back to Turpentine VC, a podcast where we discuss the art and science of building successful venture firms, VC to VC. On this episode, we're airing another biotech conversation I had with Laura Deming of the Longevity Fund and Will Eden, formerly of Thiel Capital, who is now the managing director of Sylvan Consulting. Our discussion is a primer on the evolving landscape of biotech investments, from the pioneering days of companies like Genentech to innovations in cell and gene therapies. We also cover longevity research and discuss how different approaches to biology impact investment strategies. This conversation was recorded in 2019. If you're interested to go deeper in biotech and life sciences investing, I recommend you check out another Turpentine podcast called Second Opinion. A link is in this episode's description. Now on to the conversation with Laura and Will. I'm here today with two very special guests, Laura Deming of Longevity Fund and Will Eden, currently in EIR with Erik Anderson, who notably founded Adimab, and before that spent 6 years at Thiel Capital focusing on early stage life science VC investing. Will, Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Will, you've been a biotech investor for quite some time now. Why don't you sort of give us a lay of the land of sort of the different segments within biotech that you invest in?
Really what we focused on was sort of first placements, seed to Series B. So really focused on the kind of early stuff, right? So most of these companies were preclinical, though we did some, early clinical companies, but, very, very much on the super early side of things.
If you look at the investments that you've made over the past many years, how do you bucket the different categories that they would fit in? How do you slice up the biotech investing world?
There's a whole bunch of different ways you could do it. One could be by the sort of type of thing it's doing. Cause technically we're kind of broadly life sciences, but that could mean pharmaceuticals, that could mean biotech, it could be tools and services, right? So I would say really the space can be broken down by what is the actual product the company's doing. And I would argue these are very different businesses, very, very, very different businesses. You can certainly break things down by stage, but I think that's more familiar.
So how about even within bio then? What are the different segments within bio that you might invest in?
Right. I think once you're talking within biotech, people mostly mean therapeutics. So you could do it by therapeutic area. There's antibodies, there's RNA, there's cell therapy, right? You could also commonly break that down by what is the actual focus of the company? Is it on cardiology or, aging or something like that? I think those tend to be the kind of broad types of categories you find.
Got it. Yeah, this is helpful. Let's keep outlining. How about within pharmaceuticals? How do you break up that world?
Yeah, pharma as distinct from bio usually just means sort of small molecules, and there's a lot less activity there, though. If you see things, I'm certainly curious, right? But I do think a lot of the action has been in biotech therapeutics proper, I would say.
So there's biotech, there was pharmaceutical. What was the other sort of meta structure?
I would also say there's med devices. That ends up being a pretty different world, right? Because you're still kind of working with the body and within the medical system, but the intervention's completely different, right? You're not trying to put a drug into someone's system. You might be implanting something in them or something like that. So in some ways, it's kind of much more broad. It's also different in terms of how the FDA treats them. So it's a really different world, actually. Tools and services, that's where you're not necessarily trying to sell the drugs yourself. Maybe you're licensing a key part of a drug or something like that, or it's antibody discovery or, right? That ends up being kind of the most broad segment, I would say. And, you can have very different models within that, either sort of selling, the services on a cost basis to these companies, or you can, try to get some sort of future income stream from something that's invented using these tools.
If you create a new genus in this Linnaean hierarchy, what would it be?
You asked the tough questions. Well, I would argue that the sort of digital health / tech side is trying to become a new part of bio, I would say. I don't know that digital apps, particularly, I think they've been pretty averse to undergoing FDA regulation. I would point to Pear Therapeutics as being an interesting case where they're actually the first FDA approved digital health therapeutic. That's quite a feat. And that's, as far as I can tell, that is a genuine new type of company that we haven't seen yet, I would say.
Are we underweighting how important that sector will become?
Well, it's tricky, right? Like, what are the things that digital health can do for health versus drugs, right? Are we going to get a digital health intervention that will help with cancer, for instance? I think it's hard to see a cancer cure coming out of digital health. And a lot of the stuff that Pear has, certainly in the front of the pipeline, is more like psychological, psychiatric, right? So certainly the things where we know you can have a psychological impact on the body, that's certainly ripe for it. I think a lot of the digital health people are less focused on trying to actually get an FDA approved product, though. It's much more about health and wellness, I would say, which I think is a very, very different type of company. That's not one that I really looked at much.
What technical innovations in your software or CS relevant hard science domain do you think will massively impact biotech in the coming decades?
Yeah, interesting question. I've seen some interesting nanotechnology applications where these are things that do not fit cleanly into a drug paradigm, but they're also not a med device either. There are drug device combos, but that's usually implantable devices that emit drugs. Whereas I'm talking about small, nanostructures that are doing things like chelating very specific, fractions of the blood or something, right? I mean, that's just, that also is something that doesn't fit cleanly into a current paradigm, right? It's kind of plasmapheresis, but it's being done via an injection of a nanoparticle. I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? So yeah, I think very small scale manufacturing could significantly change the face of things.
Is there anything you would add or edit to Will's description of bio or life sciences generally in terms of how he slices the world? And where would you place longevity fund as focus in that bucket?
We focus on longevity companies. That's a very broad term that encompasses all platform companies. If you knew what you wanted to do to impact longevity and couldn't because the platform technology wasn't available, we view it as on mission to invest in companies that would allow you to make the change that you wanted to patients. The one thing we don't invest in are sort of therapies focused on diseases or pathologies where there's no possibility of generalization. All of our investments relatively could impact total number of healthy years of life with an emphasis on the healthy.
For listeners who may not be as familiar, can you describe what a platform company is?
I guess I could try to take a crack at it, but it might be a little bit more of a cynical take, which is something like every company that doesn't have a platform says they have a platform. I think there's a perception that the valuation of a quote unquote platform company is higher. I think it's something to contrast it to a simple case, right, which would be a single drug, right? There is a company that has one compound, and the entire company lives or dies on that one compound. So one meaning of a platform could just be there's some underlying generative technology in some way, shape, or form, right? Maybe it's just a new assay, some new cell-based system, right? Just something that allows them to plausibly claim we're not just this single asset company. But it's also different from a pipeline, right? Because a company could have, say, 3 drugs, but there's no real underlying rhyme or reason to why they have those 3 drugs, right? And there's no underlying technology there that means they'll have a 4th drug ever, right? So that's kind of a distinction, but in some sense, it's almost defined by what it's not, right? It's not a single drug company. It's not a pipeline. It is a platform.
One illustration of that value you've just described that platform companies ascribe to themselves would be a conversation that Mark Levin and Steve Holtzman, two of the canonical leaders in Biotech, had. They had founded a key platform company, Millennium Pharmaceuticals, in the 1990s. And as a result of this experience, where they had a multi-billion-dollar sale to Takeda, they came up with several principles for how to raise money as a platform company. And they were, don't sell equity for money. Don't take debt. Don't give up any rights to anything in your pipeline. So basically, none of the traditional ways in which to accrue value are open to you. And the conclusion from this was to only take gifts. And what that meant was to convince pharma that you had some kind of internal process that was so valuable, they should give you money and, in a sense, pay for the privilege of supporting your work to then be part of the conversation of where those programs later went. And the fact that this was a deal that was on the table made me give some context as to how a platform company might present itself.
Though how would a platform company even get to the point where that sort of deal is on the table, I guess, right? At some point, they have to take money from somewhere, right?
I think this is a very extreme case of Martin Shkreli and Steve Boltzmann being very good at their job, perhaps not generally applicable.
Let's zoom out a little bit before zooming back in and maybe give a little context or history to life science or bio investing. So it's 2020. Let's even start last two decades. What can you talk about? What can you share about how life science investing and biotech investing has evolved over time? How has it intersected with traditional venture tech VC investing? And where are we now?
Oh boy. How far back in the history do you want to go?
As far back as you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the early biotech companies were actually coming out of the biofuels stuff happening in like the 70s and particularly the 80s. And then you basically got Genentech founded, and that was really the first sort of commercial proof of principle that something like biotech was actually feasible and possible. And you got a bunch of fast followers. And I would argue that we've seen a couple of sort of waves, right? I think you had the first wave in biotech largely in the 80s. I think that sort of had a ton of success, like a lot. And then I think you got sort of another wave of interest around the same time as the tech bubble in 2000, and then I think we're currently in the middle of I would say a third wave of heightened interest. How that relates to the tech scene, as far as I can tell, tech investors are always interested in trying to get in on that action, right? Because they're seeing these things and it looks, really, really powerful. But there's often not a lot of kind of domain expertise there at the same time. And so, I would say the pattern has been, tech money gets interested, but there's often this barrier where it's sort of difficult for them to sort of get into the best deals. And, I don't think tech returns have always been spectacular when sort of trying to get into biotech. And I currently think we're kind of in the middle of that stage right now, where a lot of traditionally tech VCs have started to raise biotech funds. And it's still, yep, absolutely. And I would argue it's still too early to tell. If you have some thoughts on this, I'm also curious.
I'd be curious, what do you think is the rational thing to do if one highly weights that viewpoint?
Right. I mean, it's something like you could try to keep tech funds, or keep the biotech funds in biotech. But oftentimes there are these benefits to these sort of weird crossovers if you can make them work, right? Something like Pear doesn't neatly fit into that dichotomy, but yet they were primarily financed by biotech VCs, right? They weren't financed by tech VCs. I do see much more interest in the tech side in platforms. In part because there's ways to monetize platforms without having to go through the FDA. And I think that sort of allergy to the FDA has been one of the things that's held tech funds back, because they're always trying to find an angle that involves less regulation. But at the end of the day, if you're going to get a treatment into a patient, you almost certainly have to engage the FDA in some way, shape, or form.
We defined platform companies earlier, but can you maybe give some examples that the tech VC firms are interested in based on, or have invested in?
The novel platform company would be Genentech, the first ever biotech.
Sure.
Which was founded around the ability to recombine DNA, and is now well known for its expertise in antibody therapeutics.
Let's give more canonical examples that sort of, if there's three waves as you discussed, what are sort of like the big companies that marked each wave, or big trends that marked each wave?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the 90s and like 80s companies are kind of household names now, right? I mean, you had Celgene, Amgen, Genentech, Biogen. I mean, name any big biotech company, they almost all emerged from that period. It's very hard to find examples outside of that.
What did these companies do? Or like, was it all different things? Was it similar trend, but different?
They all sell drugs.
They make and sell drugs.
Yeah, that's right.
You can talk a little bit about new modalities too, right?
Well, right. I mean, as you point out with Genentech, it was basically the idea that you can have biology creating the drug for you, right? And that opened up a whole new world. You got protein therapeutics, you got antibodies, right? The new modalities that we're seeing now is like cell therapies, RNA, things like that, starting to get to much more complex drugs, basically. I mean, like, what is a CAR T cell, right? It is a full-blown T cell that has been pulled out of a human, modified, and put back in. I mean, that is the most complex biologic we've probably ever administered to someone, right?
Can you define some of these varieties? Can you define cell therapies and RNA?
Yeah, cell therapies are effectively the idea that you're taking some cell type from the body. It could be from yourself or it could be from a donor. And you're either just sort of like putting that back in straight, or you're modifying it in some way, changing it, influencing it. But ultimately the goal is you take cells and you put them in a body. Yeah. And, stem cells are probably the thing that people hear a lot about, and there have been a lot of kind of stem cell clinics. I think the results from those have been equivocal, and it's been one of those interesting sort of gray areas that wasn't super FDA regulated. But it's notable that despite it not being regulated, it's not like we saw like a big VC boom in stem cells right away. You saw a bunch of like independent experimental clinics. It was much more a bunch of doctors trying out this new technique than it was a sort of boom in the kind of broad investment and sort of startup world. Yeah. And now I think you're starting to see more attempts to use stem cells in a way that fits the paradigm better, where these people are actually trying to get things passed through the FDA and actually do trials and such.
One additional reason modality shifts or the introduction of new modalities can seem as very important to new waves of groundbreaking companies emerging is the expertise that old companies build up over time no longer applies to the new methods of production. And the inherent advantages of scale expertise give way, it just in those waves very quickly to new companies that are pioneering these methods. And so if you're going to look for a space of next-gen genetics, you really look to see the new modalities emerge. And there have really been quite a few of them after quite a long time.
Yeah, true. I didn't mention gene therapies, but that's a huge one also, right? Gene therapies, it's pretty much what it sounds like, right? The idea is you're trying to modify the genetic code of a like living, breathing human, right? That's a very tall task, but we're starting to see the first approvals in that ever now. So, I totally concur. You didn't see the techniques pioneered by Genentech come out of a pharma company. You saw a new wave of biotech startups. And that's what really made the Bay Area itself such a hotbed for this stuff, because it started here. Like, this was the epicenter here. And that's what made it a second hub that in many ways equals the hub that is kind of like the world's sort of global hub in this stuff is Boston, right? But on many metrics, San Francisco is, similar or close. And it's basically because of the 80s and because there's this completely new type of company that formed. And I think we could be seeing that now, right? I think the commercial adoption of these complex therapies like cell and gene therapies, I think that could end up being quite challenging. But if these companies are the next Genentech, I think they're largely emerging, at least at the start, as small independent startups, and it has the potential to actually create new hubs, I think, which is not something that you see very often.
Hubs is in new San Francisco. What San Francisco?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's absolutely the potential for that, right? This stuff could end up being pretty widely distributed, or it might be concentrated, or it might exist in a hub that, currently exists now. But I think there's at least the potential for it, which I don't think those opportunities come along very often.
And what has enabled that potential?
Good question. Do you want to try to tackle that?
Exactly what we've just been talking about. To put it concretely, since 2015, all of these approvals of new modalities have occurred, new ways of making therapies, and you have seen no new ways of making therapies approved for decades. Before that, I think literally.
Yeah, actually decades.
What led to that approval? Did the technology get better? The regulation got, you say approval, you mean FDA approval?
If you actually dig down into the histories of each one, cell therapies were tried, 30 years ago for like HIV. It's been a lot of decades of sort of tinkering with this concept, continuing to try it and trying it in new diseases, right? Like now folks are trying to use it for cancer, but cancer wasn't the first application they tried, right? Similarly with gene therapies, there were some unfortunate early incidents that happened in the history that I would say, set gene therapy back by like 15 or 20 years, where they sort of went into humans a bit too quickly. It wasn't safe. There were some problems with it. And it just really got sort of cracked down on very, very hard.
Is that what happened to you?
No, fortunately. But yeah, I would say these are the result of technologies that have been worked on for literally decades, and we're finally seeing them come to fruition. And I think if the environment around science and technology progress and the FDA had been different earlier, I think we would have probably gotten a different result sooner. That's my guess.
To put a last pin in the point, if you imagine the impact that the iPhone App Store had on the numbers of tech startups and what it enables you to do, imagine that you had 5 of those come out in the past 3 to 4 years, and what that would do to the number and types of tech companies emerging. And that is exactly what's occurring in biotech today.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a B2B SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication, SCIM provisioning, role-based access control, and audit trails. That's where WorkOS comes in, with easy-to-use and flexible APIs that help you ship enterprise features on day one without slowing down your core product development. Today, some of the hottest startups in the world are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know, like Perplexity, Vercel, Jasper, and Webflow. WorkOS also provides a generous free tier of up to 1 million monthly active users for user management, making it the perfect authentication and authorization solution for growing companies. It comes standard with rich features like bot protection, MFA, roles and permissions, and more. If you are currently looking to build SSO for your first enterprise customer, you should consider using WorkOS. Integrate in minutes and start shipping enterprise plans today. Hey all, Erik Torenberg here. I'm hearing more and more that founders want to get profitable and do more with less, especially with engineering. Listen, I love your 30-year-old ex-FANG senior software engineer as much as the next guy, but honestly, I can't afford them anymore. Founders everywhere are trying to turn to global talent, but boy, is it a hassle to do at scale, from sourcing to interviewing to on-the-ground operations and management. That's why I teamed up with Sean Lanahan, who's been building engineering teams in Vietnam at a very high level for over 5 years to help you access global engineering without the headache. Squad, Sean's new company, takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent so you don't have to. With teams across Asia and South America, we can cover you no matter which time zone you operate in. Their engineers follow your process and use your tools. They work with React, Next.js, or your favorite front-end frameworks. And on the back end, they're experts at Node, Python, Java, and anything under the sun. Full disclosure, it's going to cost more than the random person you found on Upwork that's doing 2 hours of work per week but billing you for 40. But you'll get premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost. Our engineers are vetted top 1% talent and actually working hard for you every day. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Head to choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the wait list. So Laura, how do we get rich? The tech investor perspective.
The number one way is to start a company.
Right. So, let me just understand. So big companies in the 90s, they made Genentech, et cetera. They made drugs. What did they make drugs for?
I mean, with Genentech, it was insulin. Right? It was very hard to get insulin before. You would have to extract it from, a mammal, right? Yeah. Whereas that was the first time they basically could mass produce it. Right. That was their kind of core thing that they proved was possible.
Right. And so like we didn't have innovation from decades. Why not in 2000 to 2010? Like what was missing, or why didn't we have any? Was the low hanging fruit picked and then we just didn't have anything else after that, or why was it?
It's a hard question. That's actually just a very, very hard question.
But now we have the equivalent of 5 app stores, I guess. So if you were, now it's 2020. If you were in 2005 versus 2010 versus 2015 versus 2020, like how would your investment thesis have changed based on what the market is? Like how is what you'd look to invest in have evolved over time? You haven't been doing it since 2005, but you've been doing it since, some time.
So something that we've seen emerge is basically a new model, which doesn't really look like VC in any other field. And it's really just emerged basically immediately before and then through the financial crisis. And it's basically a model where the VCs themselves are actually creating the biotech companies. Third Rock, Flagship, Arch, Polaris, Atlas, like these guys are the heavyweights in the field today. And almost all of them do most of their money internally. Like they find the science, they build these companies, they put in CEOs, they are the CEOs sometimes. This has become, I would say, the dominant model. You can still find like bottom-up startup creation, but it's a systematically different set of VCs that invest in those sort of two groups of companies. So it's very clear the last decade has resulted in a completely new business model being driven by the VCs, actually. I can't think of anything equivalent like that in tech.
Yeah. What has enabled that in the last decade within, like why has that happened now versus not 20 years ago?
Even if you go and look at the successes in the 80s and the 90s, the VCs were still often very active, but that was also true in tech, right? It used to be much more common to like swap out a founding CEO. Like that's something you used to do.
Yeah. In some ways, tech venture seems less active today.
Indeed. Indeed. That's the lesson that they've learned. Yeah. Whereas in biotech, even going back that far, I looked at some of the most successful companies and I found something like a little over half of them. The VCs did swap out the founding CEO before it became like a really, really big company. And I think that what makes bio so hard a lot of ways is the kind of like biological complexity. Yeah. And I don't like the word randomness, but it feels random to someone who's working on the problem. And so I think that a lot of this new biotech model has emerged in response to those unique risks in bio, where they're trying to put in much more money because if the first drug doesn't work, you can test a second drug, right? They're putting in professional CEOs that they know well. They've like worked with them many times, right? They have a track record. Bio has really become much more about sort of lowering risk, I think, and that has driven the business models. Whereas I think tech VCs are still seeking risk.
So if the first wave was Genentech and the third wave is right now, help describe what the second wave was and if that didn't have any big companies.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. It's hard to point to a lot of big successes during that area. I think that a lot of it was being sort of pulled along by tech just because everyone was so excited in the VC model in general. I think Vertex dates from that era, I believe. Yeah, it's much, much harder to find them. I think like the smaller specialty pharma companies, some of the ones that are still independent are out there. But I think some of what you started to see is with the, like, yeah, when you got the wave in the 80s, those companies got big before the sort of incumbent big pharmas thought they should buy them, right? And a bunch of those companies have subsequently been bought for a lot of money, but a lot of them are still nominally independent. But I think after that wave, big pharma realized that they messed up. They messed up by not getting in on this game earlier. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of the successes you started to see emerging in the 90s and the 2000s, those got bought much faster, much earlier when they're much smaller. Right. And so even though those things become super successful, when you look at the drugs that those companies made, they're like buried in like 3 different pharma companies because they've like traded the rights and it's been a long time. So if you actually go back and you trace the lineage, right, you can find these companies. Yeah. You can find traces of these companies, but they're much more integrated into the system today.
Right. In the last 20 years, help me understand, what is sort of the scope of the biggest exits in biotech? Like all I know is StemCentrx at 10 billion. Is there something
that was a really big one?
Is that like one of the biggest? Is there something at 50? How many decacorns?
Pharmacia was in the same range is STEM-centrics, but generally when it's above a certain size, we call that like M&A and like consolidation, right? So like Celgene was just bought by BMS, right? That was a massive deal, but I think people don't call Celgene like a startup. That wouldn't be called like an exit per se, right? So yeah, I think there's something like a soft cap of around 10 billion-ish where you see a few at that number, and above that, I mean, it's just consolidation among these like really, really big companies.
Why is it so hard for a startup to ever get that big?
Yeah, I think a couple different things actually. One is the funding environment. It's really expensive to take a drug all the way. And if you just look at it from a financial perspective, again, we've sort of entered this era where the really big companies tend to be built by the VCs, and the VCs have a timeline and they want to exit, right? And so you get this dynamic where if they can exit with a great IRR after a few years, when the drug is in phase 1, maybe phase 2, maybe still preclinical, they'll sell. Yeah. And because they control these companies, they can sell. So I think there's just less of a like financial incentive on the part of sort of anyone in the system to see companies grow that big. When you sort of look at sort of IRR based on exit, it does seem like there's a sort of magic window post phase 2 where like you just get the best exits. And companies that sort of limp through a phase 3 independently, well, there's usually a reason someone didn't try to buy them, right? And so generally the companies that go all the way, there tends to be a little bit of adverse selection, but it's just because the really good stuff tends to get bought, right? And what we've seen is like this is happening earlier and earlier and earlier with both M&A and IPOs, right? So in quite a few cases, a company might, IPO and it's only a like few $100 million company. Whereas in tech, again, you see the total opposite, which hold it privately as long as you possibly can until it's, almost a $100 billion company. And then maybe we'll IPO, right?
Is there a dearth of late stage private investment in biotech?
I would personally say so, yes.
Yeah. And yet you guys are focused on the early stage. Is it because, hey, it's hard to create a late stage vehicle or why? Or because the returns are still best early stage or?
There are late stage biotech funds, but they tend to be sort of like pre-IPO investors, right? So they'll come in on like the last round before something goes public. So they might do a mezz round and then the IPO and then expect to exit. And so their model isn't like exiting any later than the early stage VCs. They're just coming in later. And they can still get a good financial return, but their holding window is only like a few years long, right? Whereas, even the sort of company creation VCs, their holding period might be, 5, 6, 7 years because they come in so early, but they're still IPOing comparatively early in the lifespan of that company.
There was in a couple of things in your comments. One is I'm curious how public market sentiment affects the venture IRR calculation and whether massively positive public market sentiment would result in an increase in larger independent companies over time. The second observation, in bio, it seems like there might be 2 phases to a company's life. Not as much for platform companies, definitely so for a single asset company, in which the first phase involves changing the product, being able to actually make improvements to your lead drug. And the second phase involves simply testing the efficacy of that product without being able to make any changes.
Yeah, that's really tricky.
For a single asset company, that shift seems like a really big one for a CEO to take on. And tech, perhaps there's a similar dichotomy between making and selling a product, but that the ability to just completely, having to completely freeze seems like a big deal.
I guess I'll tackle the second part first because I think it's a simpler question. Yeah, I don't think there's nearly such a distinct breaking point with tech. Like the really big companies tend to be on this like smooth exponential curve. You don't get that sort of life cycle effect. Like, yeah, I get it. First, you're kind of building the product, but like you're doing it usually in conjunction with customers, right? Which is just completely the opposite in biotech. Again, unless you're selling like a tool or a service or something like that, right? If you're selling inputs to biotech, that's, I think, closer to that model. But with tech, yeah, you have this tight feedback loop from the very beginning, and the really good companies are these smooth exponential curves. And yeah, at some point you have to start monetizing it. I get it. Maybe something like B2B is closer than B2C, if you're going to try to draw an analogy to the tech sector. But yeah, I think biotech is completely unique for that very reason. Once you're locked in, you're locked in. You can't easily change horses in, mid phase 2 or something.
Imagine if Mark Zuckerberg had to market the same Facebook website that he built in his college dorm, but for a decade. That is essentially what you're doing as a biotech CEO of a single asset company.
Yeah, that's a great analogy and shows just how crazy it is as an industry. It's so different. So completely different.
Is there any way that could change, or is that that's part of the game?
The FDA is doing some interesting stuff with like personalized treatments. Historically, they've not really been super into that. It's like a drug's a drug, right? But particularly with some of these, I would say cancer therapeutics in particular, there's just much more willingness to experiment. And the idea that sort of every person has their own unique tumor is something that I think has penetrated the FDA's consciousness, and so creating a custom like cancer vaccine on a per patient basis, like that's the kind of thing that they're starting to think about now. So I'd say, yeah, personalized medicine is probably the closest parallel we can even draw. But, none of that's really that close to getting approval either. This is still in the really experimental stage. To tackle your question about the kind of public market sentiment, absolutely the public markets affect the private market. For sure. And I think a lot of why we've seen this sort of biotech IPO window is just because there's been so much public market interest. Like they've seen all of these successes. They see this new technology. Science news, right, is just everywhere. There's all this potential. And quite frankly, the tech VCs aren't giving up their companies earlier. So it's like, what are you going to IPO, right? Well, from the perspective of biotech, they're much more interested in sort of sharing that risk, right? And if they can share that risk with the public market at a low cost of capital, they're going to do it, right? So I would argue like we see IPOs because the public market is so interested in them. It's basically, at some point, it basically becomes a no-brainer as a financing event, right? It's like, why take private capital if you could get much cheaper capital on the public market? Well, turns out there's neither supply nor demand for late stage capital that's not public, at least right now on the current margin. I think we could definitely see the industry change shape dramatically if the IPO window actually closed.
How have private equity or hedge funds or other asset classes, invested into the space?
Yeah, private equities tended to avoid it. Hedge funds have been pretty interested. You can look at, shops like Matrix or Viking. They're primarily hedge funds trading public equities, but they have a very large percentage of their fund allocated privately, right? And so you find those sort of crossover investors cropping up more and more in the space, actually. Yeah, they're facing a similar concern where they have a pretty low cost of capital and they're seeking yield. It's very hard to get outsized returns as a hedge fund right now. So what do? Well, you start to buy in before the IPO. And then if you're buying into the mezz round, why not buy into the round before that? And before you know it, they're funding Series A's. Private equity historically has been a little bit more conservative because they're generally looking for cash flows. They're more recently have been some tech-oriented private equity shops that have gone a little bit earlier. But even then, they're sort of looking for a monetizable product. But Claris just got acquired recently by BlackRock. And so that really does represent, I would say, the first steps of a private equity shop really starting to take seriously the idea of, okay, we're maybe going to do some like pre-commercialization stuff in the space.
And why would they do that? Or what's the why now?
Seeking yield. It's all yield.
Well, I've wondered this question a lot. What's the significance of Martin Shkreli?
Oh boy. Yeah, what a conflicted character, right? He was doing a lot of the same practices that a lot of other people in the space were doing, buying up drugs and hiking up the price margins, right? He did it, but he wasn't a likable figure. And he did it loudly. And he claims he was doing this because he wanted to sort of draw attention to the industry. And I would say from the perspective of impact, like the FDA, after all that went down, really did start to like take seriously, like, okay, Mylan's the only one making EpiPens and they've raised the price by like, sixfold or like even more. Like actually his excess did call attention to the problem. I don't think that makes him a good or a like noble figure, but I think like he actually had the desired effect, which is like people realized there was a problem, right? And the FDA subsequently, particularly under Gottlieb, like really actually did try to sort of loosen the requirements on making generic versions of both drugs and devices as well. So yeah, I would say overall the effect was in the long run positive.
Yeah. Why don't you give a little bit of a history of the FDA in terms of, or even the last like decade or two, how has the FDA evolved their tune, and what have been some of the biggest effects of that, or what have been the biggest drawbacks of that, and where are we now? What can we expect going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the FDA is pretty different. So just for some background, the FDA, I think at this point is well over 100 years old. They were originally just trying to, do things like, how much heroin and cocaine and marijuana can you put in your like over-the-counter medicine, which is like a noble pursuit. And they've sort of grabbed more and more control over the process over time. And it really wasn't until thalidomide came along that the FDA requirements started to become much more severe. And what's interesting about that story, right? So the FDA was approving drugs based on safety only. They weren't trying to judge whether a drug worked, just whether it was safe. Thalidomide got approved in the in the EU, but it was not approved in the US. The FDA successfully held the line and said, no, we're concerned about the safety. And they turned out to be absolutely right. So thalidomide was never a problem with the FDA. The FDA responded exactly the way they should have. And yet people were so freaked out about the thalidomide thing happening in Europe that everyone demanded that something should be done. And so what did they ultimately do? They created new bars for both safety and efficacy. It was just like a completely misguided, like someone has to do something. And that's basically the regime that we live in today. And I would argue that switch, we wouldn't have chemotherapy today under that, right? Like we could never get to the point where we're testing, 4 toxic compounds in combination, right? Like this is almost impossible to do today. So I do think that there are these sort of whole classes of experimentation and certainly cost, right, has just skyrocketed exponentially. Cost to get a drug to market exponentially higher. So I think that's a huge loss. And I think if you kind of weigh the cost benefit, I think the FDA has probably been negative in that regard. Of course, you obviously don't want, heroin and cocaine and marijuana in every over-the-counter, like child's cough syrup, right?
Well, one way to frame the problem would be future lives versus current lives.
Right.
And I think the FDA puts a very high discount rate on future lives. And
yeah, I would similarly frame in terms of like type 1 and type 2 errors, right? It's very costly for the FDA to show that they let a drug through that killed people than that they held a drug back that saved people's lives. There have been economists that have tried to measure this, and it just seems like, the FDA probably costs like hundreds of thousands of lives by not approving like heart drugs sooner. I mean, that is a very real cost, but it's a hidden cost. Yeah. So I think we just shouldn't expect the incentives to align, such that we get the optimal outcome. That said, I think the FDA has changed a lot, and I think the FDA is actually getting better in a number of ways. And I really didn't think I would say that before I really like dove into the field. But I mentioned, a bit about kind of like personalized treatments. That's interesting. That's experimental. But like even the fact that we have gene therapy, CAR T, right? I mean, these are, again, complex biologics with these like massive effects on the body. And the fact that the FDA is willing to like engage and approve that, right? It's even gotten to the point that people are worried maybe the FDA is being a little bit too loose when it's approving drugs for these like, super, ultra orphan conditions. It's like, okay, there's only 100 patients in the whole world and you did one trial of 10 patients with no control. And it seemed like compared to their peers, maybe they did better using historical controls, ? And they approve it. So if anything, the FDA has become loose enough that it's starting to actually get blowback from the other direction. So I think that's at least a good sign that they are taking this problem seriously. There's also been a lot of talk about like changing trial design to make it more flexible and to having a sort of like different bar you need to meet, right? Depending on certain cases. I think that's interesting. That's only really just begun to be explored. I don't think adaptive trial designs have been used more than a few times yet. So this is still very, very new. I would also point to the history of like getting CAR T approved. Some of the early experiments with CAR T cells for cancer killed people. And when I saw that come out in the news, I basically thought CAR T was set back a decade or more. And to my surprise, the FDA lifted the hold and let them continue the trials. I was shocked. Like that for me was a turning point where the FDA looked at it and said, you know, look, these patients only have a few months to live and they've cured a bunch of them. Actual cures. Some people died. Some people lived. They were all going to die before they got the drug. And they decided to just weigh it up and move forward, you know. But you only get that because these people had a few months to live, right? And I think if it's something like getting a new drug in like cardiology, that's like the largest effect size we could possibly have, something that could cure heart disease, right? But like heart disease is like slow, silent killer over decades. So they're never going to like let a drug that, you know, only kills, you know, 1 in 1,000 patients through. Like they're not okay with that, right? So it's very context dependent, but I think the FDA is doing a better job at taking that context into account than they used to, I would say.
And how do you expect the FDA to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years?
You know, a lot of that probably depends on the political climate and the FDA commissioner and other things that are pretty hard to predict. The trend has been, I would say, quite positive. But I could not tell you where it's going to be in 5 or 10 years, actually.
One maybe very bad question would be, how is the FDA different from venture? You could see both as holding onto a rate-limited resource that constrains the progress of startups and making somewhat correlated decisions as to which startup should go forward and which startup shouldn't.
I mean, one is a government agency and one is a market process. That's a massive difference.
So I think that's true. I would argue maybe one thing, which is I think people overly focus on the FDA slowing down the progress of groundbreaking therapies. The big problem from a personal perspective would be the lack of groundbreaking therapies to move forward. I don't think that there are many which are simply being completely blocked.
Sure.
That I could point to today. One thing the FDA does do, which may be pernicious, is widely propagate ways of thinking about drug development biology, which may be very standardized and incorrect or not fully representative of what's going on. Venture also does that. So I don't think that venture is bad in all the ways of the FDA for all that's good. It may also be bad, but I do think they share some common traits which may actually hold back the progress of certain startups.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're both bottlenecks. I think they're bottlenecks in different parts of the process. But I totally agree that like attitudes of VCs can certainly affect what gets funded, and that sort of affects things upstream. I guess I would say with VCs, you sort of have like the pull side where like money is like trying to find good ideas and fund them. And they do have their own sets of biases, of course, like as do pharma companies, like funding trials, right? I mean, there are a lot of kind of angles on this. I wouldn't say any of them are perfect. On the flip side, you sort of have like the push motive coming from a lot of like funding agencies, right? There are tens of billions of dollars in basic research funding coming from the government, coming up with a ton of ideas, right? And I think the problem on the VC side more often is we see 100 ideas and we don't think we can fund any of them. Then that there's like a groundbreaking idea where we're like, oh man, we can't fund that. I'm not going to say that it never happens. Like I personally have seen companies where I believe that the product works, but because of business reasons, I don't think I could fund them. I have been in that position and I've seen it, and I totally hear you. And I think most VCs are a little bit too conservative. I would like to see a little bit more risk-taking, a bit more moonshots. But certainly before I became a VC, I was much more convinced that it was like insufficient, awesome stuff happening on those earliest stages where there just weren't good ideas to fund. I am less less convinced of that now, actually. There very much are good ideas out there worth funding. Some of them are fundable in the VC model, some of them aren't.
If you can wave a wand, either of you or both of you, and change anything about either VC attitudes or VC approach that would bring about the outcome we all seek, what might that be?
I'm fascinated by the idea that funding basic science can be profitable. And I'm not sure if you would call that venture capital, but I hope someday institutions will emerge that do that.
How do you imagine that looking, I guess?
I don't think it's possible right now for all areas of research. In fact, it's very obviously not if you run the calculations. I am curious if you were to look at the most productive researchers and select a group by certain characteristics each year, whether you'd find their aggregate royalties back from their companies might, under some financial terms, be enough to make that kind of model profitable. So from a very simple perspective, that's something that I'm curious about, but I haven't run that analysis.
Yeah, I looked a little bit at like power law dynamics among IP, and it seems to be very extreme. There are a few patents that generate, most of all patent revenue, right? Though I think some of this is confounded by the licensing terms. I would say most academic institutes give up IP for actually, I think, like pennies on the dollar for what they're actually worth sometimes. Though again, I think some of this is because it's hard to tell ex ante what is actually going to work and not, and there's problems with translation, and I think there are good reasons that they're somewhat systematically underpaid, but certainly if you could identify and advance the valuable IP, there's definitely money there. There's absolutely money there. I mean, if you're talking about folks that have like less limited time horizons and lots of cash, this sort of raises the natural question of like, why don't big pharma companies have like really good R&D centers, right? They spend billions of dollars every year on what amounts to R&D, right? This is supposed to be basic research, billions of dollars. Like, why aren't pharma companies able to innovate? Because like in some sense that seems like a perfect fit for your model in some way, right? These are corporations that are expecting to live for like 100 years. They're throwing off tons of cash. They fund billions of dollars.
Which do you most respect? From an R&D perspective?
I mostly think they're not doing good work, but it's a question of like, it seems like the most natural thing that would fit the model that you're looking for would be like pharma companies actually doing good research, right? Like they have long time horizons in that they expect to exist for a long time. If they make a drug, they can profit on it for 10, 15 years. And yet they don't seem to be able to actually produce reliably good work.
Is it something that's systematically holding them back, or is it just incompetence?
That's a good question. If it's incompetence, you'd expect it to be more sporadic instead of more total across the board.
One recurrent theme is pharma companies making all the right products. So looking at their pipelines, having all the blockbuster drugs, the next generation, and then stalling them out when another organization with different incentives presses pause.
I think my answer to the magic wand scenario, if there's one sort of change I could make, it would be something like outlaw marginal contributions, right? Just actually make it illegal to take the old drug and make it like 20% better, right? And I know this is going to be incredibly controversial, but I think if we actually said like, no, you will never get that approved. We have a drug for that. You have to do something actually new. You have to do something new. You have to do something with a large effect size. I think that would actually light a fire under everybody, under the researchers, the funders, the pharma companies, the startups, the VCs. If they all knew that they had to come up with something genuinely new, I think they would actually just take more moonshots, and I think we would actually get more out of it.
For pharma, maybe, if you look at biotech today, would you say the majority of new credible startups funded are not working on novel approaches?
Way more than I'd like. When you look at it in aggregate, there are a couple of companies that are doing something like a totally new therapeutic modality. You have like Avello doing like tons of bacteria, right, as a treatment. Like, okay, that's actually novel, right? But it's like when you look at acquisitions, it's like a target becomes hot, and then you have a bunch of startups get acquired that happen to be working on that target, and a bunch of new startups emerge working on that target. Or I would argue like rare genetically defined diseases. Like I'm glad that, those 100 people are going to get a treatment. What about the 100 million that are going to get cancer and heart disease, right? So I would argue that there has been a lot of investment in things that are marginal, either in terms of like the number of patients total, or marginal in terms of they're not that much better than like the Me Too competitor who's, a month behind them.
I think I disagree with that, or if you were to take the portfolios of Flagship, Atlas, Third Rock, would you argue that, CRISPR, mRNA, cell therapy, that those aggregate portfolios represent Me Too follow-on approaches, or that there are many other companies that are in that category that dwarf those aggregate startups in number?
Yeah, I would say that it's hard to point to a sort of emerging therapeutic area that doesn't have at least a handful of companies doing it. And there's a question of like what the kind of marginal benefit is over those others. I basically think that it's good that we have many shots on goal, actually. But at the same time, you're also picking like, the very most top end of the VCs and saying, well, is that good enough, right? But I'm interested in the full stack, right? I totally believe that there are a handful of good VCs that are doing stuff that's like really out there, right? What's the median biotech startup doing? I think I can pretty confidently say, just having looked at hundreds and hundreds of these, that like the median biotech startup is not interesting and is not novel, right? And that's just like a lot of wasted effort, years, dollars, that I would just like to see repurposed into something that's, trying a lot harder.
This would be a regulatory way to get about that. Is that approach because, hey, there's no other market way to do it, or because, hey, we're regulating it so much, this would just be a more effective thing of what we're already doing?
It's more just I'm trying to like pull out any stops that I possibly can to get anything to happen. It's so slow compared to what I think it could be, right? That again, if I could wave a magic wand, right, there's all sorts of things I could do, right? But like at the very least, I sort of trust that one to like redirect people's efforts, right?
Well, what would you do about patents? How would you alter those, or can you give some context on how that works?
Patent law is another one of those things that's changed a lot over time. And I think knowing where the right place is very difficult, actually. It's possible to keep things as trade secrets. A lot of the particularly platform type companies will have some patents and some trade secrets because they don't want people to be able to perfectly copy it. But if it's something like a drug, like you just have to publish about it, right? Like you have to like release the chemical structure of it. Like that is just part of the like FDA process. So there's no real way to sort of get a competitive advantage in the space as it exists today without that. So like, would we need patents if you could, just like freely sell drugs? I mean, sure, people used to do that all the time, right? I think that would look like a completely different system than we have now. I think it would be pretty hard for pharma as it exists today to basically exist without patent law. If anyone can freely copy the drug, why do you spend $1 billion trying to get that drug to market? You basically would have to spend multiples more than that on marketing just to make sure that, you can penetrate consumer consciousness enough that that's the only drug of that class, or like the only literal exact drug that they buy, right? I just think the entire market falls apart. If you pull out any one piece of it, right, the whole system looks radically different. So I don't think there's going to be one simple change you could make, like just, pulling out IP completely that wouldn't, radically change the whole system. And I think given other incentives right now, like we wouldn't produce a lot of new drugs. But, there's also small shifts in patents as well. I think I will just like address a common misconception, which is the idea that, tech is super competitive and bio is like really monopolistic because they have this, IP for like 20 years on these drugs. If you actually just empirically look at it, tech has such strong network effects. You get a bunch of monopolies. Whereas biotech, you get a bunch of Me Too drugs. It's the literal exact opposite story from the story that everyone tells. Biotech is ruthlessly competitive. It's ruthlessly competitive. And tech is too early, right? But once you have a winner, we do see them unseated every so often.
30 years or so?
Yeah, right.
Facebook, Microsoft, yeah.
Yeah, totally, right? But even something like Microsoft, it seemed like it was a monopoly for a while, and then it seemed like it wasn't, and now it's one of the most valuable companies in the world. Yeah. So it's still doing really well, even though it's not a monopoly, technically. But yeah, I would say with bio, the IP allows the model to exist as it is. We would need something radically different if we didn't have it, and the protections are really not as strong as you think. I will also say, because of the influence of tech, the patent law has actually gotten significantly weaker. So you can't do something like literally copy someone's exact molecule, sure. But you often don't need to do that to find something that acts pretty similarly. And a lot of the patent law around things like, half-life extension or things like that, that's getting thrown out actually at a much higher rate. Yeah. And we have started to see pharma do a little bit less of that, where they're making these slight tweaks to drugs and then selling them. Still happens sometimes, happens less than it used to, because patent law has actually been weakened by tech.
Right. In tech, we do think a lot about, or we are thinking collectively about antitrust as it relates to, how do you make it so someone can disrupt a Facebook or a Google at some point? But then also we're having this conversation about, are these spaces somewhat public goods, or are they somewhat the commons? And how do, and that's why people are excited about crypto for a bunch of reasons, the possibility of decentralizing control. What's sort of the equivalent in the biospace? One, is antitrust a concern, or is it not because it's ruthless competitive? But then also this concept of the commons or public goods. How do people think about that in bio, or do they not think about it?
Oh, I'd argue there are parallel conversations happening, but not quite that. One thing that I hear a lot is like the government spends a lot of money doing pretty fundamental research. How much money actually comes back to the government from the output of that research? I think that's a very common complaint.
And who capitalizes off that?
Right. So I would say that's one way in which is parallel. You don't hear calls to like break up pharmaceutical companies because they have too much market power. And if you just look at it objectively, most of them don't have that much market power. The total size of the pharmaceutical industry is large, but the total number of players is large. It's like dozens of companies.
And why aren't there monopolies? Is no network effects, or like what is?
Yeah, you start to see monopolies on the margins, right? You get the Shkrelis, you get the Mylans, right? So like occasionally, rarely you see those emerge. And yeah, they use their pricing power to the fullest. They absolutely do. But again, that's like how the system was deliberately built. So I do think there are those issues on the margin, but they tend to be the smaller things. That said, like the price of insulin has been going up really quickly recently. Well, guess what? There's like a lot of different types of insulin. You want them for somewhat different situations. And we're starting to see more stories about that. When something as vital and as widespread as insulin starts to have issues with pricing, that's when we're going to see politics start to really hit this sector pretty hard, I think. So no, I don't think there's a lot of talk about monopoly. There's a lot of talk about pricing power. Should the government be able to negotiate drug prices? Should it be able to buy in bulk? Should we be able to import from overseas? Like, these are all very real questions. But it's about pricing. It's not about monopoly.
One of the things we were talking about before we started recording is that the way you or what you'd want other VCs to think like you in terms of you see things. What was the word used? Indeterminate or determinate?
I think.
Why don't you introduce this concept?
Yeah, sure. I am stealing this from Thiel, and the idea is: do you have a worldview that fundamentally believes that you can understand the world? Right? Is the world determinate? Right? Can you figure out the way a system works? Can you modify it? Can you do this reliably? Or is it indeterminate? Right? Like, biology is this complex system. It's extremely hard. We have all these unintended consequences. You don't know what's going on with every single piece of it. They're two radically different worldviews, right? And I basically think that most of the biotech field as it exists today, and again, I think this is maybe, somewhat less true, in the first wave of companies, but like the current belief implicitly looking at how people in the space act is that biology is fundamentally indeterminate. That we cannot say things for certain, that we cannot know if a drug will work, that we cannot know what the effect of something will be until we test it. And I think that is a pervasive worldview all the way from like how stuff gets funded to the basic research, how the scientists think about it, how the VCs structure their companies to like avoid this, like all of it, start to finish. I think that's the fundamental driving factor in why the sector looks like it does today.
And so what are some constraints from what would other people need to believe to come to that view? Like, what is the crux of the difference?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask them, they would probably say that I'm not indeterminate, enough for the space, right? That they've experienced this for decades. They've experienced the losses, they've experienced the surprises and the failures, right? And I think in the face of that, it's really hard to then believe on a deep level that they can actually predict how things turn out. So I think it's more something like, can we either develop better tools and ways of analysis and ways of thinking and things like that will get us to better answers systematically, right? Or do we need people to just be willing to sort of go more out on a limb, right? And that's something we don't see a whole lot of today.
And say more about the implications of what that mindset would lead to. Just way more risk, way more.
Yeah, we would certainly see a lot more risk. I think we would see a lot more sort of seemingly crazy ideas. I think we'd see more complex interventions than are currently tested, right? There's so much focus on okay, we're going to keep the, experimental group and the control group almost exactly the same. We're going to vary this one tiny piece, and then we're going to look at the effects in a whole bunch of different ways. And that always gets you the same answer. It's a complex system. We saw some effect and a bunch of unexpected stuff, right? You don't see things like Coley's toxins, which was done, again, a century back. It was just a guy who took a bacterial sludge and injected it into tumors, and it occasionally cured them. But the funny thing is, the FDA actually allowed a couple of people to try this pretty recently, right? But it was 100 years ago that we came up with the idea, and despite seeing cancer cures, it never developed into a systematic field of exploration.
Laura, where do you stand on all this?
I think I kind of flinched when you were making that analogy. I love it, actually. I think it's such a powerful framework. Recently, I have come more around to the belief that the very best people in biotech are much more determinate. And certainly if you ask the CMOs or CSOs of many large pharmas, they do view their pipeline as a portfolio, and they will not tell you that a drug will work with high certainty.
Right.
But in sort of the neonatal stages of working with grad students, a decade ago, I remember viewing the world in a very indeterminate framework, and I think one thing that kind of changed for me recently was viewing that more as linked to competence. So somebody's expectation that something will work a certain way being linked to their competence and less to a general worldview. And I think the determinate people or the competent kind of set often will predict that something won't work, but they'll have a reason why you couldn't have known a framework for what they expect to happen and a reason for why you couldn't have known why something would work out in the first place. So I basically the most successful common people I know in biotech have much more determinate worldviews than one would expect. And I think there are just many, many, many people in biotech who are not well trained or who associate words with the idea that these words have proven constants behind them. For example, cancer or cancer model is assumed to be actually a cancer model. And really, the first person who created that mouse would have told you, no, it's real, here's what I'm doing. It's an experiment for these reasons. But now there's all this kind of vocabulary that incorrectly implies we know what we're doing. And it's just been kind of passed on to the next generation. But I think the really good people kind of see through that a little bit and really do understand what is meant by certain words, and it allows them to make better predictions.
Yeah, I guess my experience has been I ask people to make a prediction and they're just really, really unlikely to be willing to give me any concrete number. And I think this is somewhat true for people in general, but these people are scientists, right? They're testing the hypothesis for a reason, and they won't even give me a confidence interval about how likely that hypothesis is to be confirmed or not. I mean, surely implicitly somewhere in there, they must have some idea, but they almost seem to have this Stockholm syndrome where they won't even admit it out loud because it's putting those beliefs to the test, even insofar as making an on the record prediction of what might happen. Pretty rare.
There are some moving stories. For example, the founder of GPCRs being taken off HHMI and having to support his lab on salary from being an emergency room doctor, which may make one more humble about predicting sort of scientific competence. But yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, is that an example or a counterexample of the thing I'm talking about, right? I mean, like, he wasn't sort of believed in by the field, but he was right. Right? Like, I think that's like the rare example of sort of when this thing works. Like, it was a guy who's sort of crazy and didn't have the faith of the field, but he believed in the thing and he got it done, right? And he got approved. Yeah, I mean, I suppose one question is just like, is there a way that we could enable that kind of person more, or do you think we're sort of making the right trade-offs in terms of who to fund, who to not fund, and how?
How many of this category of person do you think exist?
Well, empirically, there have not been that many, right? But has their, impact been sufficiently disproportionate that we should try?
How do we think about non-trained scientists investing in biotech? Have many famous biotech VCs been scientists? How do we think about this?
Great scientists have this characteristic, which is that they bend over backwards, in Feynman's words, to get at the truth. And you need that in a startup. However, that often comes with a huge reticence to even speculate on things that could be outside the realm of probability. I call it scientist speak. It's a way of talking that prefaces everything with a, well, I don't really know what I'm talking about, or this probably isn't true, but, and it's a way of signaling to others in the scientific community that you really are quite competent because you're aware of how much you don't know. Entrepreneurially, that's very hard to translate over.
That doesn't sell.
Right. And so if you look at many great companies, they come with a pair. You have the Bob Swanson and the Herb Boyer. So the person who can really sell the vision, take out, in the Genentech IPO roadshow, they literally had these little beads that they would click together to show recombinant DNA. And there's a great visual. But then you also have the pragmatic truth seeker who can help the organization get to what may actually work biologically.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's hard to find those two in the same package. That is exceptionally, exceptionally rare, which is why it's always good to have a co-founder. And you see this less in tech, but it's not zero in tech often either. There are often a pair of which one of them is more socially competent and one is more technically competent. But yeah, in terms of non-specialists in biotech, I am not formally trained, right? But what I did do is spend, hundreds and thousands of hours, like, just poring over scientific journals and papers, right? And just like learning on my own time a lot of the particular details that you need. And so do I think that you need a formal credential? I'm not going to lie. It helps a lot to have other people take you seriously. Do I think it's an absolute requirement? I sort of can't really believe that in some sense, right? But, look, I think there are different things that you need to evaluate when you're evaluating a startup, right? It's not just whether the product is good. It's not just whether the science is good. It's whether we believe that the company can sell itself. Yeah. If nothing else, it has to raise another round after this one, almost always, right? And at most, if they're actually selling like a tool or a service or some other input, they actually have to generate sales. Right. So from that perspective, all else equal, it's probably better to have someone with a lot of training in science evaluating the scientific aspects of the company. And I would say in biotech, that really matters, right? Because it's not like in tech where, you can push something to production and it doesn't go that well. Well, you can, pull it back and fix it and put it back out again right away. You don't do that once you've started the FDA process, right? So I do think actually having that upfront expertise is extremely, extremely helpful. But at the same time, I think that non-biotech experts can still evaluate a lot of the same features, right? Because they're still startups, they're still companies, they're still businesses.
I guess I was curious what gave, in your mind, Thiel, the confidence that he can make a statement like about sort of our need to be more determinate. What gave confidence in his own sort of understanding of science, and maybe him, like you, has spent all this time, self-training basically. Or I guess how would you, or is that, do you not need that in order to?
Well, I think for some of him, it's like a philosophical worldview, right? Like he fundamentally does believe that we can understand the world, right? And from there, I think a lot of being a VC is just about developing these sets of heuristics for who to trust and why. And again, you can always select on the sort of non-scientific correlates of a business, right? Yeah. You can tell whether someone knows how to sell, right? And that's always true. That is a universal skill. So again, I don't think you have to be technical yourself to evaluate a startup. You can always get someone to help you.
Yeah. So, well, you've seen, because you've been doing this for some time, Laura, you have too, you've seen how longevity as a space has sort of evolved over time. Why don't you guys talk a little bit about how that sort of emerged as a category and how it's evolved since?
In 2011, longevity was a barren wasteland with tumbleweeds occasionally kind of pulling through. There had been only a couple companies ever started that claimed to target the aging process. And on the biology side, there was a lot of promising science, but clinically there was nothing there. This year, you're seeing literally the first drugs show data in patients that are targeting mechanisms of aging that we're excited about. And that's a huge step forward. We don't know whether this first wave of therapies will result in drugs that work, but having patients exposed to drugs that sort of came up through this field it's the first time in human history that that's ever happened, and it's really exciting, and it's happening literally the past couple of years.
Yeah, I think there was a social inflection point that came with the announcement of Calico. And I think that showed for the first time there was real money and interest behind longevity as a concept. And that, I think, changed just the nature of the conversation. The other thing I would point out happening around that same time is the rise of senolytic drugs, which you yourself were actually quite involved in. Like the first big company, like you helped start. And so that sort of gave evidence to the idea that this was something worth talking about, right? The idea that there could be these therapies that could clear senescent old cells from your body, right? That are causing these like systemically harmful effects. I think the pairing of that entire class of drugs and therapies plus it becoming socially acceptable to talk about it, I think that was like the perfect combo that just made this whole space take off. I would be curious to hear you weigh in on beyond senolytic drugs, where do you think longevity is sort of performing the best as a field, or like what things you see starting to come down the pike?
We should talk about programmed aging. I'm sure we both have opinions about that subject.
This is the time.
Oh boy.
One sort of misapplied analogy that people have tried to use in the past for longevity is the Manhattan Project, or the creation of the atomic bomb. We're definitely not engineering longevity in anywhere that level of determinism. What's exciting is two major buckets of therapies. One involves tweaking genetic pathways, which we believe might impact lifespan for some reason. I think evolutionarily it's very unclear the why. Perhaps we'll never know. The other bucket involve doing a myriad of different things that generally could fall under the heading of removing damage or rejuvenation writ large. And that includes many very futuristic things like replacing whole organs, which are also relevant for just disease in general. We're seeing both approaches push their way towards the market. The first bucket has, over 60, in some sort of classification, 90 different things in it that are interesting to watch. The second bucket has almost too many things to count, and that just so many things could fall into that heading that it's hard to keep track of them all.
Right.
And so I think what we're fascinated by is watching the first bucket, because that's, I think what we want to see is the first striking reversal of an aging phenotype in humans. And striking is the key word. A small movement on a graph is great, but a kind of striking movement in health by manipulating these pathways, I think unlocks 10 times the kind of Calico cascade of capital and interest, and genuinely like sort of scientifically motivated interest in the field. And that would be super exciting.
Fully concur with that. We absolutely need some obvious convincer. And I think, again, that just changes the whole conversation, right? And particularly changes like what funding flows to. I am definitely with you on the regenerative medicine side of things. And it seems clear if we can just undo damage, then to some degree we've solved the problem. Genetic manipulations, I've personally been a little bit more skeptical about. When I've sort of looked through most of the known mechanisms, it seems like there's a complex of growth, repair, nutrient sensing, right? And it really does seem like almost every large effect that we get on aging via these interventions has something to do with that sort of one shared common pathway. I'm curious if you would disagree with that assessment or see things that are substantially outside of that.
I can think of 4 to 5 pathways, which, like most things in biology, link together somewhere or another, which might fall into that. I do think there are some examples of drugs in people today, excluding the ones that I've, sort of Restore, Biounity, which are the ones that are explicitly focused on aging, which make mice live longer when given to the mice, overexpressed or given as a biologic, and seem to have positive effects on age-relevant diseases. And those types of things, I think, are pretty compelling in terms of, is there a protein that when administered in higher levels than one might normally see impacts lifespan? Okay, maybe it's not programmed aging per se, but that is modulating aging in a sense. So I'd put that forward as evidence in that camp.
I mean, most of the things that I think of are like rapamycin, right? Which is very, very clearly acting to like suppress.
But I think the huge story is that there's like 60, there's such a variety of different things that impact lifespan. And you always hear about rapamycin and metformin and, the insulin IGF pathway and caloric restriction and mTOR, in other ways. But there's so many more pathways that we found like that. And many of them come from outside the field of aging. So I think there's just such a huge green field of pathways potentially, hopefully, that might come more to the fore. And those pathways are super interesting. But if the field was just those pathways, I don't think I would be very excited about it. I think that might be a bit of a constrained place to play.
Is there anything else you guys wanted to cover, or you have questions for each other?
What is your ultimate goal in life?
My ultimate goal in life? I would actually like to achieve biological immortality. Like, if we can, I think we absolutely should. And if not that, I'm okay with uploading too.
So, say you achieve either of those things, how will you spend the next 1,000 years?
Well, hopefully it'll be much more than 1,000, but having fun conversations like these, I think.
What about blockchain? I'm just kidding.
I'm selling some Biocoin. I am excited about it for reasons completely unrelated to biotech. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
My guests today have been Laura Deming of Longevity Fund and Will Eden, formerly of Thiel Capital. For people who want to go deeper in your work, where else can you point them? Laura, perhaps we'll start with you.
So I have a blog at ldeming.com, and you can also look at our website, longevity.vc.
Yeah, great. And for me, I probably should put a little bit more of my thinking online, but in the meantime, you can check out my Twitter feed, William A. Eden, Eden.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Turpentine VC is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen and Econ 102. If you liked the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store or rate us on Spotify. Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.